Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 30. Following up the discussion last week about Eretz Yisrael and the Middle East, being that it's the headlines, and of course to each of us is close to our hearts, so I want to follow up with some questions that I didn't completely address or didn't address at all last week, as well as begin some new subjects, all relevant to our time and of course to our lives, which is the objective of this entire series. And I thank you again for your questions and your comments and your sources and notes. It's really been a very exhilarating and stimulating discussion, including for me, learning, delving, and looking for these sources and applying them to our lives. I will begin with one piece of feedback someone wrote, and I thought it was worthwhile reading. I'm so grateful that you have been stirring the pot. I remind the one who questioned why you would stir the pot that these classes arose out of a vacuum and disenchantment with the status quo. People said, we have Chassidus, why would people look in other pastures to find peace of mind? And the simple answer to that is the way they have been teaching Chassidus has not provided the peace of mind that people seek. Finally, you came along and decided to demonstrate that Chassidus can in fact provide all the peace of mind we need to be happy, living the life of spiritual and Chassidic growth. And Chassidus is the place to look for all the answers. How successful have you been stirring the pot? Just look how many hits each video has. One must assume that each hit is a person who is seeking to apply Chassidus in their lives. And you are generally reaching more than 1,000 people per share, in some instances far more than that. I want to thank the writer. Obviously the encouragement is always good. Obviously I also would love to hear critique, so we can make things even better and improve them. My real hope is that this should stimulate many others to do exactly the same thing, each with their own voice, each in their own way. Ein Dei Sein Shavis. Each has their different approach of applying the Chassidus of the Rabbeim that they dedicate and gave their lives for, to make our lives the best it can be and prepare us and the world for Mashiach. Another additional note that I want to read. I wish to thank you for all the research you have done to shine clarity on the matter of secular studies, a subject that was heretofore never quite clear. When I came to Bnei, Rab Nissen's grandsons were being taught to read and write French by one of the Bochum. This was a clear hiddah from the Rebbe, directive. As in Bnei, there was zero secular studies. If you want to check for accuracy, you can look up the different grandchildren's comments on this. This was specifically addressing secular studies, which I hope to follow up on in this episode, some more questions and more details that I have not addressed. But now going back to Eretz Yisrael, the Middle East. So I discussed at length the central role of Eretz Yisrael, why it's so important in Jewish life, especially Apiteid al Chassidus, as the Rebbe elaborates, and why it should matter that which is going on there to us and to everyone in the world. I also addressed the issue of anti-Semitism, the psyche of Purim, Tavshin Chav Hei, and many more details in connection to that. What I did not address completely was how do we speak to people, respond to people who are liberal anti-Israel friends, as well as how should we look at the escalating battles in the Middle East. So I want to begin with the second question, how should we look at it? The Rebbe himself gave us many, many sichos over the years, and especially in 1991, Tov Nun Aleph, the end of 1990, 91, the year Tov Nun Aleph, the Persian Gulf War. And there's so many sichos, I'll just mention, so if we can look them up ourselves, and they all are relevant to today because it's happening in the same region. And the Rebbe put it both in biblical context and in Messianic context, Mashiach context, giving us an understanding. Obviously, the famous Yalkut Shmeini, where it says, Amad Melech Paras, a Persian king will rise and attack another nation. And they will go to Aram. Aram is the Western world. And people will, everybody saying they're frightened, what's going to be? And Bnei Yisrael will also say, we're frightened what will be. And the Eibishter say, Al tisyara, don't be afraid, my children. Because everything I'm doing for you. Higi ezman gulaschem. It's a Yalkut Shmeni that the Rebbe quoted a number of times. And if you want to look up specifically, I can give you exact sichas. Bereshis, Chayesora, Vayetze, Ve'era, Boy, Yisrei, Nose, Bolag, Veschanan, Tzav, and Kiseitze, Tovshinun Aleph. As well as a letter that Rebbe wrote that year, Chafei Oder, Tovshinun Aleph. These are all published sichas, the Rebbe, and different aspects of them. I'm not going to review it all here. But I do want to point out a few key things that are brought in these sichas that are extremely relevant to our time, and maybe even more relevant than they were then. As we know, that Rebbe, a visionary, when he spoke about something, he didn't just mean it for that moment. It was the whole period in time. Because remember, the Middle Eastern conflicts are not new. They go back from the time of Avram Avinu, predicted in the Torah, the famous Bris Ben Absorim, when Nofel Ema, when a dread fell on Avram Avinu that night, a dark dread, the Medrash says that all those Lashenas there, the Ema, the Cheshecha, and so on, are all representative of the empires that would come and control and terrorize the Jewish people. All the way to Golis Remi, Golis Edom. So these battles have been being fought in different forms or fashions throughout history. So to understand what's happening today, you really have to just retrace the steps. That doesn't console us, but it gives us strength because it puts things into context. And then there's an end story. And the end story, as the Yalkut Shmoni says, Higi ezman gulaschem. All this is leading to something. It's milchomes and it's pachad and so on, and fears. But as the Rebbe explains, Yizbaru v'yislabna advorim, as Daniel says, things become clear. And that itself, the clarity, when you see a terrorist to be a terrorist, and when you see a good person to be a good person, that clarity is a siman of Geula. When things are confused and you can convince yourself that a good person is a bad person or a bad person is a good person, that's a far deeper Golus. So these sikhs talk about it. But I want to point out one or two other things that is less known. And that is, at Settle, this is a note that the Rebbe wrote, an answer to Rabbi Greenglass. Rabbi Greenglass, who lived in Montreal. So Rabbi Greenglass wrote to the Rebbe the following: Matzosi behemshech matzazu tofresh mem. Rabbi Greenglass found in the Maimer matzazu from the Rebbe Marash tofresh mem. That would be 1840. 1880, tofresh mem. It's actually the year the Frierdiker Rebbe was born. He writes like this: Val derech ze yuven, the Rebbe Marash writes, Masha Omer Avram Avinu olav hashalom. Lu Yishmol Yichi Lefonov. Yichi Lefonecha, he says. Avram Avinu was asking that Yishmol, his son, should live before him, live and continue his legacy. The Imei Yes, and this is the Rebbe Marash's words, that even Imei Yes, Shebevadai lo yehoyanela mimenu, that for sure it was not concealed from Avram Avinu. Echusei umuhusei, the personality and of Yishmael, v'yoda benuvuosei mashiyeh ba'achris hayomim, and he knew in his prophecy what will be at the end of days. Nevertheless, he prayed Lu Yishmael Yichi Lefonecha. And Rabbi Greenglass writes to the Rebbe, Lahoyer, from the Zohar HaYedua, the end of Pasha Va'era, where it says that Yishmael will initiate a war against the West, against Remi, against Edom, and there'll be casualties on both sides, and then as Israel, the Bnei Yisrael will rise and Mashiach will come. So he's asking the Rebbe, is that what the Rebbe Marash is referring to? Now I looked this up, the Rebbe Marash's words are not printed in any previous Maimer. So it's just interesting that even though Avram knew what Yishmael would do, Barachas Hayom, the Rebbe Marash should write this in 1880, is itself a fascinating thing. And the Rebbe responds, from the way he writes, it looks like around Tovshin Mem, I would say. The Rebbe writes, Umezeir Chelegimel Seif Parsha Bolak, And then he says, not just say Chelik Gimel, he says also, Piyut Yisrael Neisha, on the second day of Slichus, we say a Piyut. The Piyut of Yisrael Neisha, where we say, Kilei Sayir V'chesnei. That Kila, which means they should be annihilated, or they should be consumed. Sayir goes on Edom, which is Esav, Rome, the Western world, and Chesnei is his father-in-law, which goes on Yishmael, because Esav married Yishmael's daughter. V'oid, the Rebbe concludes. This is a zettel the Rebbe writes. So let's look into Parsha Va'era and Parsha Balak in Zeir, since this is Zeichen. It's also Zeichen, the Rebbe writes about it in a footnote in Boy Tovshinun Aleph. He also writes about it, page 280 in Sefer HaSichos Tovshinun Aleph. What does it say there? I just want to read a piece of a Zayar, which I just found extremely fascinating, that the Rebbe writes about this already 30, 40 years ago. And of course in 1991, we're talking 24 years ago, 23 years ago. So first in Sof Parsha Vayera, what does it say? That Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chia were walking in the path, we're traveling. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chia, why are you quiet? Don't you know that Torah repairs the world? Rabbi Chia starts crying and sighing. He says, because it says, "V'tehei sarai, akora ein lo vlad." Ve'aldo, oi. He's saying, oi, that Sarah didn't have a child. Ve'alahu zmana, ve'elidas Hagar Yishmael. Oi, to that time when Hagar gave birth to Yishmael. So Rabbi Yossi asked him, but she ultimately did give birth to Yitzchak. So he says, but had she given birth earlier, Yishmael would not have appeared. And then it continues on how Yishmael will begin to cause tzoros at the end of days. He brings Lu Yishmael Yichya Lefanecha. So it is Lefanecha, I'm sorry about that. And he continues on how the sod of Yishmael comes to Ataina, to the Eibishter, and says, Yishmael was gemalt also, he also had a bris. So why is he not getting reward? So the Eibishter says, because his bris was not complete, it was not at Tomim. It wasn't at 8 days, it was at 13 years. But he should still get schar, the Sar says, should still get reward for the fact that he ultimately did have a bris of Avram Avinu. So the Eibishter says, okay, I'll give him schar, I'll give him control over Eretz Yisrael, but since his bris is not shleimus, I'll give it a control over Eretz Yisrael when it's still a midbar shmama, when it's desolate. And that's the oi, the vei, the time that he gave Yishmael control over Eretz Yisrael. However, once that time and the reward is paid up, then Eretz Yisrael will go over to control of the Jews. That's what he says here. And then he continues. And that time, in the end of days, Yishmael will initiate wars. And he will get, Bnei Edom, he will get involved in these wars. And there'll be 3 types of wars. War on the sea, one on land, and one samuch l'Yerushalayim. A battle that will be close to Yerushalayim. And then he continues and says, V'yimshul eilu aleilu, they will each conquer each other, but Eretz HaKodesh will not be controlled by either of them, not even by Bnei Edom. And then they say, you say that Am Echad, a nation will come and attack Rome, Remi HaRosha, which is the nation of Edom, which is basically the Western world, the Christian Western Roman world. There'll be a battle for 3 months. There'll be casualties, and then the Eibishter will empower the Eden, and Mashiach will come. That's Seif Parsha Va'era that Rabbi Greenglass referred to, and the Rebbe agreed, and the Rebbe added, now Seif Parsha Balak. So I look in Seif Parsha Balak, and what do we find? Couldn't believe what I read. You could look it up yourself. So what does it say? It says, B'yem Hashishi, on the 6th day, on the 25th day rather, of the 6th month, this refers to Elul, Chafei Elul. So what does he say? 3 walls will fall in Rome. And then he continues and says the following. This is the main thing. And there'll be a war between also Yishmael and Rome. That's what's mashma there. That's why the Rebbe writes a Pasha Bolak. And then he continues and says like this. He says like this. Yizdazeya aro kadisha memches milin sarchene ache dehave bei mikdasha umarta choda min tochus ari yizgala. This means the following, that a tunnel, Maida, a tunnel from under the earth will be revealed, and from this tunnel will come out a eish chazaka, a strong fire, lisrei fa'elam, to burn the world. That's what he says here. Umamaida yigdel ono, if I'm reading the Hebrew translation, echad godel ve'elyon. Reading this, it's like often an open prophecy. Exactly that was found. A tunnel or tunnels from where a fire of terrorism emerged. And here also he continues that the battles will rage until Mashiach will come, v'yoram keren armei, and Eden will rise and Mashiach will come. So how do you look at these events? First of all, obviously our heart goes out and it's a tragedy, every loss. But in the big picture of things, is the end story of battles that have been fought from the beginning of time. A battle between Chesed, Gvura, and Teferes has to prevail. And ultimately, the Torah that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu and to the Eden by Har Sinai will impact the entire world, including the Notzrim, including Bnei Edom, the Christians, including the Muslims, Bnei Yishmael. That's why the Eibishter asked them if they want to receive the Torah. They asked them if they wanted to receive the Torah. They said no, but ultimately, as the Zohar says, that prepared the way that ultimately they would receive it. And Oz Apech El Amim, and the nations of the world will come to peace. That's the end of the story. And the Rambam says that despite all their misgivings, besides all the negatives, the Hashgocha Protis, the mystery of Hashem's way, that they both paved the way, Natsus, which is Eden, the children of Esav and the children of Yishmael, paved the way to bring Mashiach to the world, Agdus to the world. That's what the Rambam writes at the end of Hilchos Malachim, Perek Yiralef. Except it was censored, so you don't find it except ironically, in Tfus Remi, in the Roman Tfus of the Rambam. So this is a context. Obviously, much more can be said, but I thought it would be very intriguing to read these texts. I want to add one more thing, that there's a Maimah, Tofrei Samaches Koil Dedi, from the Rebbe Rashab, and then Chazer over by the Frierdiker Rebbe in Tofresh Pei Aleph, and then again in Tofshin Tes, published in Tofshin Tes, where he talks about all the empires, and then talks the last Golus will be what? Golus Edom and Golus Yishmael, Netzach and Heid. And he says, Netzach and Heid, Netzach is sheer passion and determination. Heid is sheer Kabbalah Seil. So in Klippa Netzach and Heid is a passion that we see coming from that part of the world, Shtus the Klippa. But it's a passion. It's not mediocre and it's not passive, passionate. And the tikkun is passion of Gedusha. So the tikkun to fighting the Klippa of Netzach and Heid, which is respectively Edom and Yishmael, as he speaks in those Maimorim, is the Nitzachon, the Midas HaNitzachon, like he speaks in Bos Legani, the passionate commitment. And Heid, so even though we don't have the Giluyim of Chesed, Gvur, and Teferes, but we have what Anshe Chayal, simple people have, is sheer determination and sheer Kabbalah Seil, Haidah, where we accept our mission. And that is the counter-challenge to the birur, the refinement of those two klippas of Edom and Yishmael. This is briefly some of the context of the events going on. This deserves far more discussion, but suffice it for now. Let's go now to addressing, and I'll read the question which I read, but I'll read it again. It's getting harder and harder to have national conversations with people about Israel. A lot of people I know feed into the propaganda that Israel is an apartheid state and are committing genocide in Gaza. Even more horrifying is that I can't count how many times Israel was compared to Nazi Germany in recent weeks. While I was advised to stop fighting a pointless war with misinformed friends and acquaintances, that this is an irrational hatred for the Jews, Amalek manifest, I can't help it. I spend hours brooding of this. It just makes my blood boil so badly that I need to do something about it. What is the appropriate way to respond to my liberal, anti-Israel friends who side with the Hamas terrorist organization over democratic Israel? It's interesting you call them friends. If they side with them and they call for the annihilation of every Jew on earth, so I don't know how much of a friend they are. They probably don't even know that maybe in the charter of Hamas. But briefly, the answer is, and this comes straight from the Rebbe. First of all, the Rebbe did not hold of debates. Debates go nowhere. It may be nice entertainment for people who like to see debates. Debates usually evoke people's ego and pride and principle, so they dig deeper in, and you get nowhere with debates. Especially a debate of this nature. If the mere fact that they already think like that, what are you going to do? Start speaking seichel? They start bringing all kinds of citations from the UN and from this one and from that one. A PR war is being fought, and unfortunately, in some cases, many people have been brainwashed, and it's already a given. Many Jews, frankly, start using language that the propagandists have put into our mouths. That's why you have to call a spade, and number one is you have to be clear in your own mind, which is why I discussed last week what I discussed. I'd be happy to send anyone a link to a discussion that I have going through all the details. It's actually a dialogue about Gaza. I wrote it a number of years ago. All the questions asked and all the tinus. So you just have clarity on your own. The expression is da masha toshiv. You should know what to answer to an applicatus. But then it says al tan ovul bav lose. You shouldn't answer. So what does that mean? The answer is very simple. You should know what the answer is. Doesn't mean you have to always answer. Engaging in conversations usually is not fruitful. But to know for ourselves, you have to be very clear. And then you can figure out what to say, what not to say to each individual. So number one is, don't think choose your battles. This is not a battle that we have to fight. The bigger battles to fight is to convince people. But you need to be clear, and you need to find an opening. And obviously, if you can clarify it to somebody. But I would not get into debate. You have to take the high ground, and you have to take and clarify to the person facts that they simply don't know. Sometimes it may be good to give them something to read, because heated debates get emotional and don't usually go very far. It makes our blood boil all the time when you hear things on CNN or you hear things in the Times or in other newspapers, just buying into this type of equal treatment that here they were killed, here they were killed. It's biased, it's anti-Semitic, frankly, sometimes intentional, sometimes not intentional, and it's definitely ignorant about many, many things. Israel's far from perfect, and not everything Israel does is perfect. That's not the point here. But to claim that one side that calls the destruction of another and destruction of every Jew on earth, to put them in the same breath as a country that never has anywhere in the charter the killing of every Arab or every Hamas person, is ridiculous. It's a non-starter. Would you go negotiate in business with someone that says, I want to annihilate you? It's a non-starter. I don't even want to sit with you. So let's not go even further than that. You have a grievance? So let's get a level playing field. I don't call for your annihilation, you don't call for my annihilation. They will never do that, because it's part of their religious beliefs. It's part of their theological faith that Israel doesn't belong there. It's against the will of Allah. So there's nothing you're going to do to change that. So to start creating a whole propaganda based on an obstinate position that is never changeable is a ridiculous discussion in the first place. You never can win such a debate, because they will never change their position. So you have to keep negotiating against yourself, basically. So you have to have very clear, you have to understand the history of Israel. The history of the so-called Palestinians is a myth. It's a name that was created. Arab leaders themselves have said it. It's basically a way to undermine Israel and so on. They were refused, they were refugees, Arab refugees, and there was no such thing as Palestinians altogether. I'd rather not go into all the details, because as I said, I want to apply what I just said to myself. I'm not going into debate. It's clarity of facts. Occupied land. The word occupied, you could say disputed land maybe. But Israel won it in a defensive war. What makes it occupied? But we all use that word. As soon as you use occupation, you're already putting yourself on the defensive. On and on and on, words that we use, expressions and so on. So the point I'm making is, don't get into debates, but get clarity. You must know. You must understand what is the root of why they will not recognize Eretz Yisrael. Why don't they recognize? They don't recognize it because it's against their faith. Other Muslims may also not recognize, but they're not going to say it openly. Or they say we have to compromise because Israel is a strong power right now, etc. The bottom line is that don't get into debates, get clarity. But while we're on the topic already, I want to broaden this discussion into another question which been asked to me not just now in this series of my life, but also over the years. And that's the general attitude, what our attitude should be to non-Jews, including people who, so-called, think like non-Jews. And again, I say, write to us to the Meaningful Life Center email. I'll be happy to send the dialogue, which has all the details, everything. The Palestine occupied, all the arguments back and forth, pretty fairly represented actually, but I think will really clarify many matters. And it's important to get informed. I don't think the platform here is to discuss all the details. So let's broaden this now to a question as the attitude interacting with non-Jews in general. And here's some of the questions. With a rampant anti-Semitism flaring up, and I already discussed last week the roots of that, how is it even possible to influence non-Jews in the importance of keeping the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei? It seems that no one would care what a Jew says as a universal directive. Very, very good question. Question number 2. I'm pursuing a career that requires me to go to college, and as a result, I deal with Gentiles most of the day. As a bocher, if I was not learning or busy with personal matters, I knew to take tefillin with me and ask a Jew to do a mitzvah. For whatever reason, maybe you could clarify the reason. Yeshiva never instilled to me the importance of also appreciating Gentiles about Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei. The only reason I would interact with one would be to ask them if they were Jewish, and once they said no, politely wish them a good day. I know that the Rebbe speaks about Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei, but I do not see a lot of push for this mitzvah in Lubavitch. My approach to Mitzvot was in large part due to observing shluchim, or older bochrim going out and laying tefillin, giving Shabbos candles, etc. But in the case of Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei, the only action I've seen taken is passing out pamphlets. I have 3 questions. Obviously, as Chassidim of the Rebbe, we know that reaching out to Yidden is of utmost importance. But why does that mean that spreading Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei is neglected? 2. Could you maybe suggest a proper approach of how I should approach Goyim who I see during the week about these mitzvahs? 3. I know the Rebbe talked about Sheva mitzvahs, but did he push us to be more active about it? Thank you very much for the teachings, and you should be matzliach with all your future endeavors. Okay. So, let me briefly state the following. This may be controversial, but so be it. I believe, and I speak now from my own personal experience, that in Yeshiva, were not taught the Rebbe's approach to the non-Jewish world properly. We were taught certain classic statements from the Gemara and from other places. And Jews in general have a very negative attitude to the non-Jewish world for obvious reasons. We've been persecuted by them for thousands of years in some terrible ways. So we have wounds, and we have a defensive mechanism. And even though we live today in a malchus shel chesed, as the Rebbe puts it, where we have freedom and religious freedom and so on, but there's always that paranoid fear that the non-Jewish world will turn on us. What is the Rebbe's approach to that? And how should we look at it? And I believe that there's a fundamental chiddush of the Rebbe here. Not a chiddush that was not said before, but a chiddush because the times have changed, that has not yet been appreciated fully. The Rebbe, a man ahead of his time, ahead of the curve, saw the bigger picture. And many Jews, remember when Senator Lieberman ran for vice president, many Jews have the knee-jerk reaction, let's not get any attention, because then they can turn on us. Because people rightly argue, you see the golden age of Spain, you see even the best of times in Europe and Germany, and what happened? So we should always have our guard up. Many say, time to move to Eretz Yisrael is the only place where we'll be safe. So I want to address this because the Rebbe has fundamental points to be made about this, and I think it's incumbent on all of us, not optional, to understand the Rebbe's position on this, in the many sichos, particularly in the mems. I was zeichet to start writing Fabrengens and Tovshin Mem. Exactly then, when Ronald Reagan became president, those are the years that Rebbe started intensifying the talks to the extent the big Fabrengens, hours, would talk about Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei. Hours and hours. Probably hundreds and hundreds of pages. I would say 500-600 pages probably just on this topic. Now the Rebbe talked about it before as well, like many things. But the emphasis began to escalate in the mems, which makes total sense. As the Rebbe developed, sort of broadening out the concentric circles of Chabad, Nefutza and Chutza, then came the non-Jewish world, which is the entire world, and then comes Mashiach. So it very fits into the stages. Earlier, the Rebbe was focusing more on the Mezdis and the Yuds, then on the Chabad houses, then on Mivtzoyim, and then moved into Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei. Many people also are almost dismissive about Sheva mitzvahs Bnei as being some type of, they have these, we threw them a bone for 7 little mitzvahs. When in fact, it's not at all the case. And I'll cite a few sikhs, but I want to cite it in context, make it even more personal. When I wrote the book Toward a Meaningful Life, I had a major dilemma. I was writing a book which I knew was going to be published by a secular publisher and is going to be put on bookshelves all across the United States and the world, where the most readers are not Jewish, simply by numbers. I know Jewish, per capita Jews are more readers, but numbers-wise, it was for the non-Jewish world. And really, there was no book like that ever published in that way. And I had the dilemma because to write a book in a universal language for everybody means I can't write about Shabbos and Tefillin and Kashrus. It's not relevant to the non-Jewish world. On the other hand, by the Rebbe, mitzvah is integral to the whole picture. So how can I write a book without mentioning mitzvahs? And if you look into Toward a Meaningful Life, rarely do you see the mention of a mitzvah. In the introduction, I qualified it many times to make sure, but still, I felt uncomfortable how to deal with it. So I went and I asked mashpiyim and people I consulted and people I respect and so on. No one really had an answer. The best answer someone told me was, think of it like this, you're giving a shiur for a group of Jews and a few non-Jews walk in. So they happened to overhear. But here, that was not sufficient for me because here was the opposite. The majority of the readers are possibly non-Jews and maybe a few Jews will walk in. And the point I had this dilemma was, though I already had a contract and an agreement with the publisher, I literally called my agent and was in a panic. I said, if I don't find an answer to this question, I don't feel comfortable that I'm preserving the integrity. It's one thing I write a book with my name, but integrity of the wisdom of the Rebbe, though it's through my lens, so to speak, but it's wisdom of the Rebbe, I don't feel comfortable without finding an answer to this question. And I struggled and struggled. We're talking now, this is the year right after Gimel Tammuz, literally, and I didn't know what to do. But then I realized the Rebbe bavarned everything. So I started thinking, when did the Rebbe address so-called non-Jews? And then I chaptzach on televised Farbrengens. A televised Farbrengen, though the Rebbe was speaking in Yiddish, but he knew it was going everywhere. And you could see, and I started looking at these sikhs, that he speaks the same ideas, but in a different signon. And I found 2 sikhs that mamash answered my question, literally. One was Yud Beis Tammuz Tavshin Mem Aleph, and the second was Chofa of Tavshin Mem Vav. These two sikhs. What did I find there? I found the Rebbe speaks. Let's start with Yud Beis Tammuz Mem Aleph. He tells the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe's first Maisa, the first imprisonment when he was a child, and he helped protect a Jew from a policeman that was hitting him. They put him in prison. It was a dark prison, and he heard suddenly in the darkness a sound. It was the sound of a goat, of a behemoth, a sound of an animal in the other corner. And it frightened him. Then he began thinking, Mishnayos Ba'al Peh, and that calmed him down. And his father later was very proud of that fact. The Rebbe said, since the Rebbe told the story, the Frierdiker Rebbe must have a Hirah for us. And he tells the Hirah for children, the Frierdiker Rebbe then was around 11 years old. It was, I think, Tafresh Nun Aleph, 11 years old. The Rebbe, it was Tafresh Nun, because the Rebbe said it was 90 years. Tafshin Mem, so it's Tafresh Sham Mem Aleph, Yud Beis Tammuz, 90 years from Tafresh Nun Aleph. That's Hirah for children. Fine. That children, even if they're young, could teach them this idea that even though you're living in Golus, the Meiser is a Golus, the prison is a dark place, you can come to appreciate and not be afraid of the Yetzer Hara, which is the representative of the animal in the other corner, etc. In other words, each of us are thrown into a prison in Golus, and this prison, the Nefesh Elokis, is in Golus and the Nefesh Habamis. That's the Rebbe is Nefesh Elokis, the animal is Nefesh Habamis. Then the Rebbe begins a sikha and says, this lesson is also relevant to non-Jews. And clearly it was a Farbrengen, I don't know if it was a televised Farbrengen, but it was a Farbrengen in the weekdays. And he starts speaking about the whole Sheva mitzvahs Bnei. And he says, because every person, Jew and non-Jew, has 2 voices in him. The Tanya calls it Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Habamis. But in Kehelas it says, Ruach ha'adam el lamayla, v'ruach ha'behema yeredes lamata. He has one selfish voice, that's a greedy voice that speaks about me, my own needs. And then you have a second voice, which is the voice of Ruach Ha'adam El Lamayla. The Hischayvus, the responsibility that every person has, is to live up to a higher morality. So right there I saw that the Rebbe is taking a story of Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Habamis, and applying it universally to everybody. That's one. Chofav Memvav was even stronger. Chofav Memvav, the Rebbe said the following words, and you could look it up. He says that people are mistaken and they think Shem Mitzvahs Bnei is, through 7 little mitzvahs. He says it's an Iker Shebetera, because this is how you transform the world. And Sheva mitzvahs, not just that it's a rational mitzvahs. You tell them, like the Rambam Paskins in Seif Perek Ches of Hilchos Malachim, the end of chapter 8, Hilchos Malachim, that this was given to you from Sinai too. That they should do it because not mitzad Hechra Das alone, but mitzad that it was given at Sinai. As I mentioned last week in the Sikh of Purim Chafei, he says, because the Eibishter gave these mitzvahs. It's called mitzvahs. Tzavse v'chibur. And Sheva is only the negative. There's a whole bunch of positive mitzvahs, as the Gemara says in Sanhedrin. The Rameh counts 90 mitzvahs. And the Rebbe actually says Sheva just to show that it's not just 7. The Rebbe says connects Sheva to Kol Shvi and Chavivin, to the 7th generation, which maybe is a remez to our generation, our time when we have the power to transform the world. And he says it's about transforming the world. And b'meila, it's not just another job. It's the fundamental core of purpose of creation. And then he says, the Rebbe says, that everything that piseichel in Torah that can be explained to a non-Jew, that's the Even HaBeichen, has to be explained to them. And he gives a dugma for neshamas. He gives a dugma for hichos avelos. And he says the idea, why is there death in the world? Why are there tragedies in the world? Essentially, to me, it was a direct answer that the message of Chassidus and Torah that's universal, that can be understood in logic, is shaykh to everybody. The mitzvah-specific mitzvahs the Rebbe speaks about, Mavdul Bein Salam. He says, so there's a Havdalah, and what mitzvahs Jews have to do. But in the context of universal message of understanding God and the purpose of life, and understanding principles of spirituality and soul and so on, is absolutely relevant to them. I found it a direct answer to me, and it gave me direction to write the book that way I did. As a matter of fact, I remember I was in London when the book was released in England. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was then chief rabbi, they had an event, and he was at the event and he spoke, introduced, he said the book has made a tremendous impact on people. But then he said, I want to ask a question to Rabbi Jacobson. Where's there mitzvahs in the book? He asked me exactly that question. So I responded in my few words. I said, Rabbi Sachs once gave a speech about the Rebbe and asked, why did the Rebbe expend so many resources to find a Jew in the most farthest corners of this earth? It makes sense. You go fishing where the fish are. You go to New York, to London, to Tel Aviv, to Sydney, to Paris, to Moscow. There's a lot of Jews. But to go expend resources to find a Jew in Bangkok, or find a Jew in some town, some chvezvu, to bring a matzah, to put on tefillin, to light a candle, it doesn't seem like logical use of resources. And Rabbi Sachs responded, this is what I said in my talk, that he speculates that after the Holocaust, when the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, hunted down every Jew in hate, every single Jew with stethoscopes, they went to crazy lengths. If we don't hunt down every Jew with love, with more passion than they did it with hate, they will have in some way won. That's how the Rebbe looked at it. So it wasn't a numbers game. It was looking for every Jew. So I said, I believe that's very true, but I want to tell you something, I said, Rabbi Sachs, I think the Rebbe wanted something even more. Not just to hunt down every Jew after every Jew is hunted down in hate, with Ahavas Yisrael and bring them mitzvahs and bring them closer to the Eibishter. The Rebbe wanted more than that, to conquer the world. That world which was silent, that world which was in some way complicit in the massacre of so many innocent Jews. That anti-Semitic world, the Rebbe wanted to conquer it by demonstrating that Mitzia Seitzei Teira Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, that the ethics and the spirituality and the higher standards of morality and virtue and justice, the Jews should be a light unto nations. Not just we should find every Jew and run to Israel and protect ourselves from anti-Semites, but to transform them by teaching them what God wants of them. And that's far greater than just finding every Jew. I'll tell you, Rabbi Sachs is not a man of emotions. He came over and hugged me. He said, absolutely right. And that's why when I wrote Torah Meaning of Life, the first book I decided to write is to make a Kiddush Hashem, to everybody should understand the message of Torah, of Chassidus, of the Rebbe for the world. So I take this very personally, and I did a lot of research on this for this reason. So I want to refer, besides the Sichos Yud Beis Tammuz, MyLife, and Chafov, Taf Mem Vav, let me refer also to you to a letter from the Rebbe, a Yud Beis Tammuz letter, in Chelik, printed in Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yud Gimel 13, page 230. Look there, it's an explanation on the Sof Hilchos Shmita V'Yevel of the Rambam, where he talks about Shevet Levi Bilvad, not only Shevet Levi, but every person, Kol Ish V'ish, who dedicates his life to God is considered like a Kohen Gadol that goes into Holy of Holies. And the Rebbe explains Kol Ish V'ish refers to non-Jews as well. And regardless, the whole idea of that the world is ready for Mashiach, what do you mean, what world? There's 7 billion people in the world. You have to say that the world is receptive to the Chassidic Umas Ha'elam concept. So in answer to the question, yes, we see anti-Semitism. In that same Farbrengen, by the way, of Chafov, the Rebbe speaks about Yisbaru V'Islab Nadvorim, that when you see more problems, the fact that it becomes clear, that alone is a siman of Geula. That's true on one end. But on the other end, the way we conquer the world is not to retreat. Teach the non-Jews and teach the Jews who still don't know. That's how you do it. The fact that they're anti-Semites, fine. Obviously, someone who doesn't want to talk to you, you can't talk to them. But our job is not to be proud Jews, not to hide, not to be defensive, not to be paranoid. But the time has come, and that's what the Rebbe said. The reason they didn't do Sheva Mitzvot Bnei in previous generations, the halacha from the Rambam is there, is because they didn't have the opportunity. They were living in a world where they were literally being persecuted, the Jews. But today we don't live in such a world. Today we can write a book like I did, and many others have done. You can speak, you can send messages on YouTube, you can send messages in email, you can talk to people at work, and people will not be offended. Obviously you have to talk kindly, not condescendingly. Teach, educate, explain a concept, explain a spiritual concept, explain how you deal with death. I remember I went to South Africa and I met Rabbi Mesinter, introduced me there to the president of the CEO of Nissan Motors, and he was a non-Jew, a big Afrikaans guy, like Irish Catholic type, and he asked to speak to me privately, and he told me my book saved his life, a non-Jewish fellow. He told me he lost his son tragically to an aneurysm, 19-year-old, he called him an angel, he died in my arms. I was devastated, I was on top of the world, successful, everyone envied me, everything was lost. Months I couldn't go back to work. I come back to work, first meeting I have, so the accountant, they give me the papers, they give me spreadsheets, and under the spreadsheet, one of the accountants who was Jewish gave me a copy of your book, Toward a Meaningful Life. He said, I don't want any favors, I'm just giving it to you, I think it's all good for you to read the chapter on death. That chapter on death is based somewhat on the talk of Chaf of Tav Shem Mem Vav and other sichos. He told me, the man started crying, sobbing to me. He says, I read that chapter, and let me tell you what it did for me. It taught me to give God my pain and get strength in return. This is what we have the power to do in our generation. And the Rebbe makes it very clear, everyone can do it. Some people can do it on a big scale, those that have relationships with government officials, with leaders. And everyone can do it at work and so on. It's not just to do business, it's to speak about matters. You have a co-worker, he suffers a loss, God forbid, or a happy thing, he marries off a child, so he's not Jewish. Say something to him about what a soul is, what marriage is, what love is, etc. And you'll be surprised how receptive. And these and if you need chizuk, I know this goes against the grain of what we're taught, like this questioner has asked, just read the sichos. It's clear heiros from the Rebbe. Do you have to make it into official campaign? No, it's a conversation. Just like when you have a friendly person, just like you would say something kindly to any person, your friend or colleague or even a stranger, that's the idea. That's what it's about. Think of it in those terms. It's sharing a book. It's sharing an idea. It's sharing a feeling. It's sharing empowerment. And this responsibility is to everyone. And if you want to take my word for it, read the sichos that I'm citing. I want to add one more sikha that's important here. And this I also have in the Geya to Tov Shem Mem Gimel. It was Shabbos Pasha B'Shalach, Tov Shem Mem Gimel. The year of B'Shalach Mem Gimel is 83, the beginning of 83. The Rebbe, in the middle of the sikha, as a Namayim Ramuzga, suddenly speaking about Mashiach, and says, and Kemuv Mashiach will come, it'll all be peaceful, because we already yotze all the Melchamas, the wars, and Chaz v'Shalom to say anyone will have to die, including non-Jews. As the Rebbe said it. Very often the Rebbe would say something, and we would miss it, or we would focus on it. I immediately on Sunday morning wrote a question to the Rebbe, which we had the opportunity to do, and I asked, it says in Gemara in Sanhedrin, in Parsha Bolog, this was a B'shalach Sich, that it says there are two opinions, Bnei Sheis, with 2/3 of the Goyish world will die, or 2/3 of 2/3. And it's brought in many different places. The Rebbe writes, Bli neder, yiduber b'zeh mitzvah Hashem b'svadus haba. Haba leinu l'teva. Which meant the Rebbe had a lot more to say. Sometimes the Rebbe would answer in writing, a short answer, a long answer. But here the Rebbe clearly wanted to speak about it, which was right away intriguing. What is the Rebbe going to say? Here he said, Mamish, they won't die. And here the Gemara says they will. I remember that whole week I was anticipating, couldn't wait for Shabbos. So it wasn't yesterday was no Fabringen. The Fabringen was Mishpatim. So 2 weeks later, Mishpatim, in the middle of the Fabringen, the Rebbe says, mit mir gefragt. And I remember the first words the Rebbe said, the Kash is nicht auf mir, the Kash is auf the Gemara. I remember as soon as I heard that, I was like blown away. Kash on the Gemara? That means by the Rebbe, it's dover poshut that the Gemara has to be explained. Why? Because the Rebbe said, state Chas al Maisov, Chas al Kol Maisov, the Eibishter cares and has compassion for all his creation. So how could it be he's going to go kill 2/3 of his own people? Or 2/3 of 2/3? So how do you understand the Gemara? It was so poshut by the Rebbe that the Gemara can't be kipshuti. So I said, so how do we learn the Gemara for thousands of years? But I saw from the pshitas from the Rebbe that the Rebbe understanding of the whole world is different today. It could be taika they learned a different way. You're talking about Amalek, you're talking about Evdi Kachov Mazolos, you're talking about Shol Klippus Hatmei, Nachsidu Meselam. Maybe you could teach it kipshuti if that was the majority of the world. The Rebbe went on and explained the whole arichas. First he said, you can't say that it just means that they won't have the power of birth. It means they won't perpetuate. They won't be killed, but they won't perpetuate. Because that too would not be acceptable. And this sikh later became a likut sikhis, Chelik Chov Gimel, Parsha Bolog, the second sikh. And you'll see it's based on B'shalach Mishpatim. What's B'shalach Mishpatim? Because of this reason. What do you see from this? The Rebbe's view on the world is very different than most of us, which thank God is the case. That's why he's a Rebbe. And it's time for us to start aligning ourselves to the Rebbe's view. This doesn't mean you should unlock your doors and that there isn't anti-Semitism and there isn't murder, God forbid, and we see what's going on, Chman al-Islam, what happened in Florida and what happened in other places. That's not the point here. The point is the overall picture, where is it going? The overall picture is going toward a better world. The fact that there's hitches and ups and downs, yes, it's not perfect yet. That's why we don't call it Gula Mitzvah Vashlema. But overall, we have to continue forging ahead, not play defense, but play offense. And this goes back to Eretz Yisrael too. Eretz Yisrael, we are not on the defense. You want to know who we are? We're a nation that God gave us the Israel, the Holy Land. God gave us the Holy Torah. And we have a message for all of you in this world that you have to start living up to the obligations of being a person of chesed and yeshed, tzedek and yeshed, not murder, not kill, and teach people why, from the youngest of age. And if you look at the Rebbe Sichas, that's what he wanted. He wanted an offense, a new attitude. This again doesn't mean we're naive. Obviously, at the same time, you have to protect yourself from Hamas and others who want to kill you. But overall, we can influence the entire non-Jewish world, and including the people that are terrorists today, ultimately. It will spill over. And this can also be elaborated upon, but this is the approach. Instead of any type of timid or negative, defensive and apologetic approach. Again, much more to be said on this topic, but let me go to one more question, which is, since it's timely, we're coming from Chamisha Asar B'Av, so the question is being asked, what are the Rebbe's directives and points about preparing, coming Chamisha Asar B'Av, and this time of year? So let me say a few things about that. So first of all, the Rebbe would always quote, after Chamisha Asar B'Av, or Chamisha Asar B'Av by the Fabringen. In early years, there weren't many Fabringens on Chamisha Asar B'Av. It became more as the Rebbe began emphasizing a lot about the 9 days and the 3 weeks, how they should be transformed, especially in the Lameds. Then Chamisha Asar B'Av became a far more prominent. It was always a yontiv. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says, Lo Yehoy Yom Tevim L'Yisrael Ke Chamisha Asar B'Av Yom Kippurim. But in the Rebbe's words, it became far more dominant in the Lameds. Started making a siyum on Masechta Tainis very often. And he would quote the last page of Masechta Tainis where it says that the Yom Taber Magal, the Tu B'Av, why was it a Yontiv? The Gemara asks, and all the different reasons that Rebbe speaks about these reasons as all being part of Achdus. We'll soon talk about that, Avos Yisrael. But then it says it was Yom Taber Magal. It was the day that the axe was broken. It's a euphemistic way that Gemara says. Why? Because the day when the nights start getting longer. So the longest day in the year in Israel, when the sun shines most of the hours, is right till Tu B'Av. Then it starts changing. Why is that relevant? Because the sun shining dries out the wood. It's shining longer. And you need to have wood that's as dry and perfect as possible for the Beis HaMikdash. So the Eitzims, they stopped the Taber Magal, they broke the axe not to cut any more wood for the Beis HaMikdash on that day. Okay, what lesson does it have to us? So the Gemara continues. The Rebbe would bring, the Gemara continues, Mekan ve'elech di Yesef Yesef. Because loy ivra laila el legirsa, the night is created for a purpose. So when the nights start getting longer, what's the purpose of night? It's a more somber time. It's a quieter time. We're not so involved with other people. So it's a time that's more conducive to learning. So it's a time where we start learning, like he says in Chassidus Applied, Yesef Chaim al Chayev. That's the time to start increasing every day a little more. The nights are a little longer, a second more of learning. That was one Heirah that the Rebbe said. Start learning more. A second was the Avos Yisrael. All the reasons connected to Tu B'Av the Rebbe explains is about Achdus. All connected to Avos Yisrael. Which is obvious after the Churban Beis HaMikdash and Tishrei because of Sinas Chinam. What's the best way to repair it on the full moon of Tu B'Av? That's the Yom Tov, as the Arizal says, because in commensurate to the great descent of Malchus and the Yereach and the Levana on Tishrei B'Av, Yereach Levana is Malchus, which represents Knesset Yisrael and Eden. In direct proportion to that is the great Aliyah of Tu B'Av, and therefore the tikkun of Sinas Chinam is Avos Yisrael. The Rebbe also quotes that's a time to start venturing people Ksiv v'Chsim Teva. Some people say it's the gematria of Chamisha Asar B'Av, and it starts preparing us for Elul. The Shalah writes, the Rebbe cites, that Aryeh, the mazel of, which is the saddest month in the year, is about Aryeh, Leo, Aryeh the lion. The famous Yalkut Shmei, the Yovei Aryeh, the lion, Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed the lion in the month of the lion. That's Almanas, that the lion, the Eibishter should come, Mila Yira Kishag, the Aryeh, is the Eibishter comes and rebuilds the Aryeh, the Beis HaMikdash, in the month of Aryeh. But the Rebbe brings also the Shalah that says Aryeh is Rosh Tevis, Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hishayin Rabbah. So what gives birth to the month of Elul? What gives birth to the month of to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, Hishayin Rabbah? The greatest days, the ashes of Ov. So in Judaism, there's no such thing as a darkness. There's just darkness. Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av, and in the darkness, in the abyss of Aryeh, that gives birth. That's the Rosh Tevis of El Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Hishayin Rabbah. And Pasha practically also, what was Moshe Rabbeinu doing these days? He's on Har Sinai begging God to forgive the Jews for the Chet HaEgel. He's not successful until he goes up a third time on Rosh Chodesh. But he comes down Yom Kippur with Salachti Kidvarecha, God forgives them. So the tikkun, the repair of what happened with the Chet HaEgel, which led to the 17th of Tammuz, the breaking of the tablets, and then to the destruction of the temple, and all the 5 events that happened on 17th of Tammuz, and 5 events that happened in Tisha B'Av, as the Gemara Mishnah enumerates in Tainus, that's all repaired through Elul, when Moshe begs and reveals the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, then Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And Hishayin Rabbah, as we know, is the Gemar Piska, that's the Gemar HaChsima, Gemar Chsima Teva of Yom Kippur. So what do we do now in this period of time? We add in Torah, we add in Tzedakah, we add in Avos Yisrael, and we add in repairing every mistake we make. We're not yet in Elul. Elul will begin so-called the formal hachana. So these are the things that the Rebbe emphasizes for this period of time. It's also a universal lesson in life of how you take a negative and turn it into a positive. We have negative experiences. Tragically, we all know what happened last week to our good colleague, Yosef Raksin. We all know what's going on in Israel. Innocent soldiers dying just to protect other Jews. And we know there are problems. At the end of the day, we don't understand the reasons, but we have to turn it all into an increased activity of good and light, because ultimately light vanquishes darkness. That remains our motto. That remains something that kept the Jews always going. So we cry and we build. And that is also our approach as I go back to the point of we do not cower in fear and we do not retreat. On the contrary, this is the time more than ever to teach the anti-Semitic, even the anti-Semites, some of them just cultural, some of them just ignorant, to teach them the way they should live their lives. That's the opportunity we have today. We did not have that opportunity hundreds of years ago. So we have a great responsibility, each in our own particular way. We have to put our heads together and figure out how to do that, which in general is always innate. Now there's a few more topics I wanted to address. Time is limited, so let me talk about making ends meet, high tuition costs. I know it's a completely unrelated topic, but everything I guess is related. So let's address that as much as I can with the time that's allotted here. Question 1, can you give some advice on those struggling to make it financially? It's hard for me even to make this transition from this type of topic to this, but we'll do it. With tuition and life expenses so high on the East Coast, only on the East Coast, I think on the West Coast too. That's my own footnote. Is it worth it to try to find a job somewhere cheaper where the Lubavitch schooling may not be first rate or none at all? How do we avoid feeling that there is no way out of the hole of financial stress? It's all about making it financially and tuition costs. Another question. We're parents of 4 children. I work full-time and my wife half-time. We keep adding $20,000, $30,000 a year into debt with no end in sight. Since we are not shluchim or part of a school, we are pushed to full tuition. Because we earn, then we have to basically fundraise for the school. Oh, that's a question. Because we earn, then we have to basically fundraise for the school. Compared to other families where the husband learns in kollel and gets a 50% discount, it's hard not to create hard feelings. Any ideas, approach, practical suggestions? And there are more questions, which I think time will run out if I read them all. But you get the gist of it. So I want to begin this topic, and I will probably continue it next week because I don't think I can exhaust it enough necessary in this discussion here. So, let me say the following. This is a big issue. Some even say, sadly, that people are having less children because of rising tuition costs. People are saying, maybe I should take my children out of these yeshivas that charge that much and take them to a school that charges less. Should we compromise, like one questioner asks, should we compromise our children's education or go into deep debt? So I do not claim that I have a quick answer here, that I can just say, here's the answer, magic. But I will put a few key principles down based on the Rebbe's approach to it. First of all, the chinuch of our children is the single most important thing we can do in our lives. It's more important than money. It's more important than anything, because that's the future of our legacy and the future of the Jewish people. Jews are moiser nefesh for the chinuch. At the same time, there's a partnership going on. People say schools once upon a time just took everyone in and gave scholarship for those that couldn't afford it. And now it's become a business where people, executives and CEOs and fundraisers of yeshivas are getting paid nicely. And the teachers are not paid that well. And pressure is being put on parents, and literally you won't take a child in unless you pay the full tuition and so on. And it keeps rising. So are they not part of the picture? What would the Rebbe say about that? We know the Rebbe in Temchet Mim, there's no such thing as not taking in a student. At the same time, you want to pay teachers well. You don't want to pay them shabbily. So where's the money supposed to come from? So I think the approach to this has to be, since all these legitimate arguments, is to put a few heads together of people who really care about the cause and come up with solutions. There are solutions. The problem is, yes, that schools, some of them are turning it into a business and just want to do it their way. There are people who've abused the system one way or another. There are people, very wealthy people, who claim poverty. And there are many people who just simply can't afford it. So I want to say is the following. Yes, we can just go ahead and say, I'll solve the problem easily. I'll just take my children out of yeshiva. That's not a solution. Solution, we have to solve it at the root. Now, of course, I know everyone's going to say there's no one to talk to. Who are you going to talk to? You can start talking to these schools. Yes, my friends. We as parents, we as the grassroots, we as the people that support the systems can demand it. And you get enough influential people that sit down and say, once and for all, we're going to figure out what to do. I guarantee you bring a few intelligent people, a few people with clout, and speak to the boards of the different yeshivas and say, we must address this issue. It's a crisis issue. Maybe a fund has to be created, special scholarship funds. I'm just throwing out things. To just dismiss it and say that the yeshivas can do whatever they want and parents just have to swallow it all, or parents are going to do whatever they want, is going to spiral into chaos and not have good intended results. So my answer is absolutely every child deserves the best level of education, should not be deprived of it because of financial reasons. At the same time, we have to resolve this issue. And I believe if there's true accountability and there's true governance and true oversight, this thing could be settled. I know this is going to be difficult because nobody wants to be looked at, nobody wants to see who's getting which salary. But it'd be interesting to know, in the public world, you know the salaries of CEOs. If you see people are getting paid and others are not getting paid, certain teachers are not getting paid, others yes, you have to question, how fair is that? This thing needs to be looked at, and I think it's going to explode anyway, because at some point, this thing is going to reach a critical mass. So I think it's a critical issue to discuss. As I said, I really feel bad that time has run out, and I'm just ending like this on a cliffhanger here. I will talk about this in the coming episode, but I didn't want to ignore it because it's a question that has been asked many times, and I've given it a lot of thought. I looked at a lot of letters of the Rebbe, seeing the Rebbe's different approach, and there's no question we can find a solution if our intentions, it's like anything, it's like shalom bayis or other things, if our intentions are good on both ends, parents and the schools can find the solution to this. It's not going to come easy because everyone has the status quo and everybody wants to do it the way they think is the right way to do it, and I think that there could be a solution to this, but it's going to have to require a concerted effort among several people, especially people with clout, because unfortunately the people that are without clout are the ones that suffer most in this regard. So we will address this. I don't want to conclude on this negative elements. I want to just say in a positive note that Chassidus Applied, which is essentially the gift that Rabbeim gave us, you could say the gift the Eibishter gave us, is the tool to solve all our issues, whatever topic it may be. I've been asked by a number of you to actually start taking my modim and do Chassidus Applied kipshute, to take a maimer and teach it. So though I may not be doing it directly, I'm doing it a little indirectly because what I say here is not coming from my own self, it's coming from sources. And my modim talk about it, but I think it's a good idea, and I believe Nether will do that as well in the future, which is to actually take texts of my modim, not just sichos and not just the topics we've addressed, and actually show how you can apply it. I did it once or twice already when I did it with mediation from the Maimorim of Ayin Beis. I'm just and there's fascinating insights in every mimer that you can apply, even the deepest, most esoteric topics. I'm saying that in response to many that have asked this. There are many questions that I've not addressed yet. Please be patient. I will address them. There's just so many that are coming in, I must say, more than I ever expected. I can't address them all. Some require more discussion. So hopefully we'll be addressed week after week. The place to send questions confidentially and anonymously is meaningfullife.com/MyLife Live. And if you want to personally contact me so I can respond to you, because I cannot respond through the forum, I say that again, I cannot respond to the forum, is to write to Simon, S-I-M-O-N, at meaningfullife.com. And that's a personal email address of my own that only I see. And I'll be happy to respond there and communicate with any of you that want to ask anything. It's an honor to be sharing these words. And may we have the schus to merit to fulfill the Rebbe's ratzon of us, that we should actually use his words, the words of all the Rabbeim, apply it to our lives in ways that we can improve, and ultimately, as I said, prepare ourselves to the personal and the global geula, the global redemption. So until next week, this has been My Life, Chassidus Applied, episode 30. Next week, Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. will be episode 31. Thank you very much.